Imagine a small bridge. This bridge connects three huge lands. To the south is the great continent of Africa. To the north and east is the vast land of Asia. To the west, across a great sea, is Europe. This small land bridge is the only easy way for people to walk between these places. For thousands of years, this has been a busy path. People moved along it to trade goods. They moved along it to find new homes, and armies moved along it to conquer new lands. This small strip of land has always been a place of movement and meeting. This small land bridge is the land of Israel. Its location is the key to its whole story. It is a narrow corridor squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast Arabian desert. There was no other good way for a large group of people, or a large army, to travel by land between Egypt and Africa and the powerful empires in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq and Syria. If you wanted to control the world in ancient times, you had to control this bridge. You had to pass through this land. This simple fact of geography shaped everything for the people who lived there. Living on this bridge was like living in the middle of a busy highway. You could never fully relax. There was always someone coming or going. Sometimes they were friendly traders bringing new ideas and interesting goods from far away. But often, they were soldiers. Armies from the south marched north. Armies from the north marched south. They needed food for their soldiers and water for their horses. They demanded that the small towns and cities in their path provide for them. This constant pressure from outsiders made life difficult and uncertain for the people of Israel. This unique and dangerous location meant that peace was rare. The people of Israel were always caught in the middle of larger conflicts. They were a small nation surrounded by giants. Think of it like a small house built between two very large and often angry neighbors. The neighbors are always arguing, and sometimes their fights spill over into your yard. This is the world that the Bible describes. It is a story about how a small group of people tried to survive in a very dangerous place, a place where empires came to clash. Because Israel was on this main road, big empires always had their eyes on it. An empire in Egypt wanted to control the trade routes going north into Asia. An empire in Assyria wanted to control the path south to Africa. An empire in Babylon wanted to control the path south to Africa. So this small land became a prize, a piece of a much larger puzzle of power. The great kings of the ancient world did not see a holy land. They saw a strategic piece of territory essential for expansion and control. They needed to secure this land bridge to protect their borders and to project their power. This meant armies were a constant sight. Imagine thousands of soldiers marching through your fields. They would trample your crops and take your food. They would demand tribute, a tax to be left alone. If you paid, you might have peace for a little while. But another army might come next year and demand the same thing. If you refused to pay, the army would attack your city. They would break down your walls. They would burn your homes. They would take your people away as slaves. The Bible tells this long and complicated story, but it does not tell it like a modern history textbook. The books cover many centuries: Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Nearly 900 years packed into a few hundred pages. The story moves very quickly. It compresses time. A war that lasted for years might be described in a single chapter. A king who ruled for 40 years might only get a few paragraphs. It can feel like conflicts happen one after another without a break. Imagine a movie showing a character's whole life in 2 hours. You see their birth, their childhood, their struggles, and their death. It feels fast and intense. That's how the historical books can feel. The narrative jumps from crisis to crisis. Fighting the Philistines, dealing with the Arameans. The mighty Assyrian Empire arrives. The compression makes the story feel breathless. The fast pace is part of the message. The writers wanted to show a pattern, a recurring cycle of choices and consequences. A generation follows God, there is a time of peace. Then the next generation turns away. A new enemy appears at the border. Showing events in quick succession highlights the link between faithfulness and security. The narrative speed is a tool to show cause and effect. Remember, these are highlights across many centuries. Long periods of peace are often omitted. The story focuses on moments of crisis, times when the nation's survival was in question. These were moments demanding choices, trust in their own strength, foreign alliances, the God who promised to protect them. The fast-forward narrative forces this question again and again. Section 4. Enemies with a message. In the Bible's story, the enemies of Israel are more than just historical opponents. Each one represents a different kind of challenge, not just a military one, but a spiritual one. They serve as contrasts that help define who Israel is supposed to be. Each enemy carries a message and forces the people to confront a particular weakness or a particular truth about their relationship with God. The story begins with Egypt. Egypt represents oppression and slavery. It is the place of bondage from which God delivers the people. The entire identity of Israel is forged in this act of deliverance. To be Israel is to be a people freed from slavery by God. Later, the Philistines appear. They represent a cultural collision. Different gods, different technologies, iron weapons, a different way of life. The conflict with the Philistines is a struggle for cultural and religious identity in the land itself. As the story continues, new empires rise, each bringing a new lesson. Assyria represents brutal power and imperial arrogance. They boasted of their strength and saw themselves as unstoppable. Their eventual fall serves as a warning against human pride. Then comes Babylon, judgment and exile. When the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem and its temple, it is seen as God's judgment on the people's unfaithfulness. Babylon is the consequence of breaking the covenant. But this is not the end of the story. Finally, Persia arrives. Persia represents restoration and a new beginning. The Persian king, Cyrus, allows the exiled people to return home and rebuild their temple. This act is seen as a surprising and merciful move by God, working through a foreign ruler. From Egypt to Persia, the sequence of enemies tells a coherent story. Deliverance, cultural struggle, the danger of pride, the reality of judgment, the possibility of restoration. Each enemy serves as a chapter in Israel's long and difficult spiritual education, teaching them about God and about themselves. Section 5. How to survive a superpower. Faced with these giant empires, a small nation like Israel had very few options. Survival was a difficult art that required careful calculation and often desperate choices. The leaders of Israel had to decide how to respond to the constant threat of being crushed. There were essentially four main strategies they could try. The first option was to resist. This meant gathering your small army and fighting against the invading empire. This was a very brave but often foolish choice. A small kingdom stood little chance against the massive, well-organized armies of Assyria, Babylon. Resistance often led to a swift and brutal defeat, the destruction of cities and the death of many people. The prophets, like Jeremiah, often warned against this path, seeing it as a suicidal act of defiance against a reality that God Himself had allowed to happen for a reason. A second, more common option was to pay tribute. This was a strategy of appeasement. A king would gather gold, silver, crops, and other valuable goods and send them to the emperor. This was essentially a protection payment. By paying the tribute, a small kingdom could buy itself a degree of autonomy and peace. However, this created a heavy economic burden on the people. It also meant accepting a subordinate role, acknowledging that you were no longer a truly independent nation. It was a strategy for survival, but it came at the cost of freedom and wealth. A third strategy was to make an alliance. A king in Israel might try to partner with another small kingdom or even with a rival empire. For example, they might make a deal with Egypt to get help in fighting off an invasion from Babylon. This was a dangerous political game. If your ally proved to be weak or unreliable, you would be left to face the enemy alone. The prophets strongly warned against these alliances, seeing them as a sign of a lack of trust in God. They argued that relying on foreign armies instead of God was a spiritual betrayal. The fourth and final option was to appeal to God. This was the path the prophets always advocated. It meant turning away from sin, renewing the covenant, and trusting that God alone could deliver the nation. This was not a passive strategy of doing nothing. It was an active strategy of national repentance and spiritual renewal. According to the Bible, this was the only strategy that offered true, long-term security. The story shows that when the people chose this path, miraculous deliverance was possible. When they chose the other paths, disaster was often the result. Section 6. The enemy within. While the Bible is full of stories about foreign enemies, it is also brutally honest about another kind of threat, the enemy from within. The greatest dangers to Israel's survival often came not from the outside, but from its own internal failures. The nation was constantly struggling with division, corruption, unfaithfulness. The biblical writers make it clear that the armies of Assyria, Babylon, were often just the external instrument of a judgment that was earned by the people's own actions and their own poor choices. One of the most significant internal problems was the failure of leadership. The books of Kings, Chronicles read like a long report card for the rulers of Israel and Judah, and most of them receive a failing grade. We read about kings who led the people to worship other gods, who oppressed the poor, who made disastrous political decisions. There were good kings, like David, Josiah, who tried to lead the people back to God. But there were many more bad kings who weakened the nation from the inside, making it vulnerable to outside attack. Another internal enemy was civil strife and division. After the reign of King Solomon, the nation split into two separate kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. These two kingdoms were often at war with each other. They became rivals, weakening each other and making it easier for foreign empires to dominate them. This division was a deep wound that never fully healed. It was a tragic story of brother fighting against brother, a political failure that had devastating spiritual and military consequences for everyone involved. The most important voices warning about these internal dangers were the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos were not just predicting the future, they were acting as social and spiritual critics. They spoke out bravely against the sins of the kings and the people. They condemned injustice, the oppression of the poor, and the worship of idols. Section 7. The surprise of still being here. When you consider all these factors, the dangerous geography, the constant pressure from empires, the deep internal conflicts, the conclusion is simple. Ancient Israel should not have survived. By any normal historical calculation, it should have disappeared. Many other small nations and peoples who lived in that same area did vanish from history. We know of the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines. As distinct peoples, they were eventually wiped out or absorbed by the great empires and lost to time. Yet, Israel endured. This is the great surprise that runs through the entire biblical narrative. The story is not really about Israel's strength or cleverness. In fact, it is often a story of Israel's weakness and foolishness. The people made bad choices. Their kings were often corrupt. They were repeatedly conquered. Jerusalem was destroyed. Leading citizens were carried off into exile in Babylon. By all rights, that should have been the end of their story. The Bible's explanation for this unlikely survival is not political or military. It is theological. The message is, you should not exist, but you do. This continued existence is presented as a sign of God's faithfulness to a promise, a covenant made long before. Even when the people were unfaithful, even when they were punished and scattered, the story insists God did not completely abandon them. The survival of this people, against all odds, is presented as the central miracle of the entire story, a testament to a divine purpose more powerful than any empire. This perspective offers a clear path to understand the ancient text more deeply. Study the history, see the clash of empires, explore the spiritual meaning, a source of hope for millions. Analyze the narrative structure, geography, history, theology, tied into one coherent account. No matter how you approach it, the story leads back to one astonishing fact. Survival was the miracle.